How do we create a future in which both people and nature can thrive? This is the biggest question of our times. In the next few decades, we need to do something unprecedented, achieve a sustainable existence on Earth. But how do we do it? We can start by understanding how we got to this point. 20,000 years ago, humankind consisted of less than 1 million hunter-gatherers across the globe. We lived within the resources on offer, in balance with nature and of the birds on Earth. There's very little wild left. This biodiversity loss is not just a tragedy, it's the single biggest problem we face. Without biodiversity, the world as we know it doesn't work. Our planet needs its wild spaces. Every one is a component in the global machine. Only if they are all healthy can the planet run smoothly. Diversity equals stability, and stability is what we need most of all. Can we turn this situation around? Can we rewild the world? Well, maybe, due to one key change. As societies develop, something is happening that has never happened before. People are having fewer children. Globally, since the year 2000, the number of people under 16 years old has hardly changed. The main reason our population is still rising is because people are living longer. If this continues, our population may finally stop growing by the turn of the century. By investing in education and women's rights and raising people out of poverty, we could bring about peak human even sooner. This changes everything. It gives us the opportunity we need to regain our balance. For the biggest gains, we could concentrate our efforts on 4 goals: phasing out fossil fuels and replacing them with renewables. This will not only slow the warming of the planet and the acidification of the ocean, but it will lead to clean air for all of us. Upgrading to efficient food production and reducing our consumption of meat. We'll require far less space to provide for ourselves, leaving more for grasslands, reducing deforestation and our demand for fresh water, and feeding more people with healthier, more affordable food. Working together to properly manage our ocean. A global working hard to keep hold of the wild populations we still have, encouraging nature wherever we can. In the ocean, on land we no longer need, and even in our cities. If we make these changes, we'll be a long way to becoming a species in balance with nature once again. We will have taken a remarkable journey, from 1 million people struggling to survive, to several billion living long, healthy lives on a stable planet, able to provide for all our needs. Only at that point will the Anthropocene, the age of humans, be truly underway. At that point, we will be proud to call it our planet. How do we create a future in which both people and nature can thrive? We open our eyes to this moment in history. Think on a planetary scale. Embrace the challenge we face. And do something we humans are very good at. Change the world.
For the last decade, Mark Mueller, one of America's top trial lawyers and environmental advocates, has dedicated much of his time to exposing the human and environmental consequences of the release of thousands and thousands of industrial chemicals into our air, water, and land that have created a deadly human science experiment to discover the effects of chemicals, radiation, and pharmaceuticals on us and the world. The resultant climate change is the backdrop of our lives and one of the moral crises of the century. A globe-spanning force reshaping how we work, how we play, how we shop, and how we vote. There are thousands of Superfund sites, much of the groundwater, rivers, and lakes that are already contaminated. The oceans and marine life are choking on plastic. Today, our news team visits with Mark at his headquarters in Austin, Texas, to discuss some of the environmental challenges we as a human race face today. And we will discuss, how did we get here? How bad is it? Is there anything we can do to stop or reverse it? The chemicals and synthetics that are part of the modern world, what do we know about them? Household products, are they making us sick and fat? Explain the chemicals and go over a few examples. How much of our groundwater, rivers, and lakes are contaminated, and much more. And we should always keep in mind that moral element which transcends all persons and parties, and which alone makes the basis of a true and lasting national prosperity to save our planet. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Austin, Texas. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mark Mueller to the show. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thanks, Steve.
Tell our audience a little bit about the type of law you practice from the beginning all the way till now.
Well, in the beginning, I was a court-appointed criminal defense lawyer. So that meant I got appointed cases by judges to people that couldn't afford a lawyer. In those days, $75 a day maybe for those kind of cases. So that's how I started. I started doing those kinds of criminal cases and then evolved into personal injury cases of sorts, and then medical malpractice cases. And over the years, products liability cases. I was the science chair of vaginal mesh, that litigation. And now I'm involved in environmental litigation cases, toxic exposure cases, and I'm getting involved in what I would call breach of privacy litigation cases too.
Today we are here talking about some of the environmental issues that you are heavily involved with. And let's talk about some of the world's problems, if you will, how chemical companies, for example, have polluted the environment, the air, the land, the water, etc. How did we get here? How did this all happen?
We got here primarily after World War II. There was an explosion in the World War II, and then post-World War II, there was an explosion of man-made chemicals. And they started with things that were to replace gas and metal. I mean, not gas, glass and metal. So there was an explosion of I would say, man-made chemicals that were meant to replicate things that had to be formerly extracted from nature. So they were cheaper, and they were not dependent on as many resources. So we ate plastics. And we ended up with, fabricated artificial metals, things like that. Anyway, so something like 90,000 chemicals have been released since about World War II. Virtually none of them have been studied long-term, even singularly as a chemical, but certainly not been studied in combinations, which is how they occur in our exposure to them.
Now, you know as well as I know, and let's just take the tobacco industry, they did internal studies, right? They knew the dangers that these chemicals pose to the public, right? Where was the government in all of this? That's question one. And why didn't they do anything about it?
Well, the government was involved in it. There was a sort of an unholy alliance of the government, the military, and large corporations. And so people weren't too interested in regulations. If you think, back to that era, it was let's make money and let's make up for lost time. And so it was that era of American prosperity. I mean, the 50s is really, I think, when things got really heated up. And at that time, people didn't notice. It was everybody was getting a house, everybody was getting a car. Gasoline was cheap and plentiful, and off went the roll of American prosperity. That American prosperity had a cost.
And you remember the movie Dustin Hoffman, right?
Plastics,
right?
Yeah.
And nobody thought about the consequences, although I think I can say with some authority that the chemical companies knew what this would do. They knew that there would be forever plastics out there, and we're stuck with this. So that leads me to my next question here. How bad is it right now?
It's very bad, Steve. It's far worse than anybody wants to realize that it is. It's both a visible problem and it's an invisible problem. Plastic is in the rain. Okay, they're measuring now plastic pieces, particulate plastic, in the rain, in the mountains of France, in areas where formerly pristine. So think about that. Glacier lakes now have plastic that's coming down into them. So it's everywhere. And it bioaccumulates. And you picked a good topic because plastic is the big one. It's primarily petrochemical waste product is what it's made out of. Through a chemical process, they make polypropylene, nylons, all these kinds of plastics. And then they use various chemicals to harden, soften, and bend the plastics. Those chemicals are also leach out into the skin. They're used as food packaging. They're used as medicine packaging. They're used as tubing in medical devices. And they have a lot of effects. One of the effects that we have that's probably the most unknown and one of the most dangerous ones is endocrine disruption. Okay, some of the materials that are used to harden and soften plastic are mimics of hormones. So they're estrogen mimics. So your body thinks you have more estrogen in it. Hormones are very powerful. It takes just a little tiny bit to throw things off whack. So it throws your metabolism off whack, it throws your immune system off whack. And it's now leading to I don't know if you looked at the charts, there's a stair-step down graph indicates the fertility levels that are occurring now. And it's way, way down. I mean, if it gets to 100%, we're all dead. We're on the path to extinction because we're essentially losing fertility. It's hitting in the developmental pathways, these kinds of things, and at levels that are so low, Steve. I mean, you and I grew up in relatively the same era, and I was told, well, a little of anything's okay. Too much of anything's a poison. It's bad for you. That's what I remember, the folk sort of ways it was explained to me. Well, with these hormone disruptors, the levels are so low by which it already has a bad effect on the human body and the metabolism. It's like this. There's a scientific level of allowable parts per million, for example, for any particular chemical. Say it's 100 parts per billion, just make up the number. Okay, that number is usually a negotiated number between the regulators and the scientists are fighting over this and that on the other side, and of course the company scientists who are paid for to say it's all safe. So it's the same thing you've confronted with asbestos, the same thing we've confronted with smoking. But it's a negotiated number. And so you go, well, what does this mean? Okay, with the person that's reading this label, so-and-so parts per million, it's safe. Well, if it's safe at 100, okay, is it safe at 110? Is it safe at 120? Is it safe at 80? Is the number even correct? I grew up thinking that these numbers actually meant something. They'll give or take. Somebody says it's supposed to be 100 and it's at 110 or it's at 90. That's ballpark. Okay, who makes a big deal? With endocrine disruptors, and people know about, say, for example, BPA, you might see in the grocery store. No BPA. That's what people know about. So BPA is a plasticizer. BPA is also an endocrine disruptor. And so these things have effects at somewhere between 1,000th and 1/25,000th of the allowable limits. Think about that for a second, okay? That means we all have it. We all have it at levels that it's doing things with our body that our body can't relate to, our body can't handle. These are man-made chemicals, so that nature hasn't worked out a defense to these things yet. So we don't, it just, it's doing things to our body that our body's not equipped to handle.
How do we address this? I mean, is it too late? Or, I mean, is this permanent damage?
Well, that's a really good question. The answer to permanent damage is, yeah, there is permanent damage. To what extent can it be reversible in this or future generations? I don't know. Because we do know that these amounts that are very small that have an effect on you, well, they also damage your DNA. And so to the extent you're able to have children, these things end up being passed on as a genetic coding that affects the way your children and grandchildren will also respond to things.
There's no change in that. We can't change that.
Well, you know, you're in the realm of sort of theoretical science now. So can things be changed? Can you change your own DNA? I think you probably can. But then we're talking in the intersection of science and spirituality and, you know, physics and, you know, those kinds of realms. What can you do, right? You can't go to the store and buy it, that's for sure. Whether it's theoretically possible, I'm saying probably is, but we're pretty late in the process to be counting on that. You know, you know, what we always hear is politicians for years. We hear this, right? This is a classic stump speech that happens with the presidents. Well, everything is very, 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 very bad, 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 bad. But there's hope. And then they launch into this classic, you know, Clinton used to do it, all the presidents used to do this kind of thing. But there's hope if we act in the next X number of years. Well, that X number of years has come and gone. And we haven't done what we've needed to do. And now we're seeing sort of the consequences. We saw some of it in COVID, by the way. Regardless of whether you want to believe COVID is deadly this or that, or how contagious it is, or where it came from, there's no question that COVID hit people that had underlying immune problems and secondary complications far harder than it hit people with normal immune systems. We're living in an age where everyone's immune system is compromised to some level and getting more compromised as we go. So is it too late? It's never going to go back to where it is as far as I can see. There needs to be an enormous shift of focus, enormous shift of focus into what I would call remedial work with chemistry, remedial work with biology, remedial work with the environment to reverse, to the extent we can reverse, the kinds of things that are already there. What can we do individually? It's getting late in the game, Steve.
We're aware of facts right now of some of these chemicals, what they do to our bodies, what do they do to our environment. The only organization that can regulate them is the government. Is the government up to the task? When you mentioned hope, it's not too late, it is too late, but we have to do something. Is the government up to the task, or are we going to run into a situation like we just saw with COVID, where we had a president who denied the existence of this because he thought he could rewrite the narrative of people dying, right? Are we up to the task? Is the current administration up to the task? Are government officials up to the task of telling or informing some way, somehow, these chemical companies to change the way they're doing business?
No. And I'll say that because as long as there is the pervasive influence of the chemical lobbies and the financial lobbies, it's not going to happen. And you see this all the time.
So let me ask you this question. So what, if I was working at a chemical company, let's say I was the CEO of Dow or the CEO of Monsanto, right? What's my attitude? Well, people are going to die, so what? Is that my attitude?
Well, what's been the attitude so far is money is my job to make money. it's not my job to protect the population of the United States. That's historically what it's been. Now, I think if you're looking at, is the government up to it? No, the government's not up to it, at least the way we've been so far. Are the citizens of the United States and other countries up to it? It depends on the people. They could be, okay? They could be, but it means being willing to really get real with where we are, put substantial resources toward this, and be willing to put some of the executives, the lobbyists, the lawyers, the legislatures, people that are letting this get by, put them in jail.
Think that's going to happen?
I hope it does, Steve. I hope it does. Am I optimistic about this? No. Who goes to jail? It's the people on the street level that go to jail. It's the people on the neighborhood that go to jail. When's the last time you saw an executive of one of these companies, other than Enron? There's a couple of examples like that, but come on, they don't get, they end up being the heads of the EPA. They go directly from a vice president of one of these companies to working in the administration. Donald Rumsfeld, right? He was one of those guys. It wasn't a Monsanto guy. Yeah, right. These guys end up being the government. You look at what's going on with the government. Does that include the Supreme Court, right? Who do we have in the Supreme Court? Yeah, Johnson Johnson's chief lobbyist's son, Kavanaugh. His father was the chief lobbyist for the cosmetics, talc, and those kind of people. Yeah, so he paid millions of dollars to keep them from being regulated.
I honestly believe that their philosophy is, hey, people are going to die, and they would have died of something else. So, they're expendable. That's what they think. I remember reading Stalin and Mao were talking about some people on the border of, Russia and China. And I remember Mao saying at that time, well, 500,000 of my people are expendable. That's what some leaders think, Now, let me ask you this. One of the big names that keep popping up, in producing and manufacturing a lot of these chemicals that are destroying not only our environment, but also our genes is Monsanto. Let's talk about some of these cases and what's been done. Like, for example, PCBs.
Cancer causing. Everywhere. Those are in waterways. They contaminate. They also seep into These are often used. They're often were byproducts of industrial processes, military constructing processes, things like that. They're everywhere. They're in the bays, in the ocean. And there were some famous ones where the town in Alabama, Anniston, Alabama, of course, a poor black community, in which the historic way of disposing of chemicals was to run a pipe out the back door into the river. And that's what they did. Monsanto, you got a list of Monsanto. I mean, did they ever do anything right when I look at the chemicals they've produced? Let's name, you got a few names, Steve? Let's talk about them.
Yeah, let's talk also about GMOs. Because Monsanto is very big in that business, okay? There are seeds that are produced that fend off insects, let's say, and so you have a healthy crop. But not enough knowledge is known about how those foods affect human beings. What is being done today in the U.S. government to try and regulate the GMOs that are produced, for example, by Monsanto? Anything?
Okay, so let me give you another example. Teflon. Almost all of the audience knows about Teflon. It's the non-stick component of frying pans, essentially. It's one of the miracle molecules. Okay, who wants to scrub pans for hours in a kitchen, right? So this was an easy answer. But Teflon is one of those molecules. It's slippery and it's not known in nature, so your body doesn't know what to do with it. Teflon was concealed. They knew there were problems. DuPont knew there was problems with Teflon, not just problems, but they knew it was causing cancer. They knew it was causing inflammatory disease. For over 50 years, they concealed all that. Maybe some people have seen the movie Dark Waters. Right. That's about Teflon. Okay, that's one example. Now they're
called, by the way, forever chemicals.
Forever chemicals is
in and of itself is a problem. Because everything is supposed to decompose and regenerate.
That's right.
But that's why when you mention you have plastic in the rain, you have plastic in glaciers, that's why you see all this plastic in the oceans, you know, and this waste that's contaminating our waterways and our land. That's why we're doing this show, because the bottom line is we just can't keep doing the same thing over and over, because it's going to end in disaster.
It's already ending in disaster. In the Amazon jungle, which I've been to, which was pristine. Okay, I mean, you can get lost down there in the waters and the trees, and if you've ever flown over it, it's just an amazing green, and it supplies, you know, it's been called the lungs of the earth, you know, with all the vegetation it creates. Now that, of course, is being burned and things like that to try to get at the use for agriculture. But what people don't realize as well is that they're using mercury to extract gold and to bind with gold down there, and it gets flushed into the rivers. So now the rivers in the Amazon, which for a long time were relatively pristine, now have toxic levels of mercury in the fish, 4 or 5, 6 times what they're even allowable in the supermarkets in this country. This is getting people, kids are involved in the gold mining extraction too. So if you know about this, mercury binds with gold. So they take the mercury and it pulls the gold, and then they have to burn off the mercury to extract the gold. This is essentially the process, and it gets washed away. But in the process of this, there's created mercury fumes, and then mercury gets swept into the rivers, and it gets absorbed by fish. Those fish get eaten by other fish, and they end up being toxic to humans if they eat them. And they affect the fish's reproductive system. So it's crashing ecosystems as well.
You know, you interviewed a well-known expert in the area of the environment. Tell our audience who this person is, and more importantly, after you say that, you did a Zoom interview with them. Yes. Share some of this interview.
I interviewed Dr. Daniele Mandrioli. He's the head of the Ramsini Institute, which is one of the world's leading research institutes located near Bologna, Italy. They've done groundbreaking work on TCEs, on benzene, asbestos, many of the other chemicals that have been declared carcinogens. These guys have done the groundbreaking work. Dr. Mandrioli is conducting the largest study ever on glyphosate. It's a comprehensive several-year program to investigate the effects of glyphosate and its many different fabrications of the product and the effect on the human body over time. So from reproductive to end of life type thing. Of course, they have to do it with laboratory animals. So that's what they're doing right now. Now, here's an interesting thing, Steve. I found out talking to Dr. Mandrioli. He says, we're studying these different formulations of glyphosate. I said, what do you mean different formulations? He says, well, there's different formulations in European, and there's different formulations in the United States. And I said, well, why are there different formulations in different countries? He says, well, it has to do with the regulators. I said, well, what are some of the problems that you're having trying to study these things? And he says, well, one of the problems is we don't know what's in them. So why don't you know what's in them? You're doing research on these things, these chemicals. Why don't you know what's in them? He says, they're protected by trade secrets.
Let's share that interview right now.
So the Ramazzini Institute is a research center, a non-profit research center located in the Castle of Bentivoglio near Bologna. We did for the last 50 years research on toxicants and chemicals that have been shown in our very lab to be capable of inducing cancer. We are the largest cancer bioassay program in Europe, second in the world after the US NTP by the NIH. So our activity now is particularly focused on the global glyphosate study. The global glyphosate study is the largest experiment ever performed on pesticides, where we are aiming to investigate the effects of glyphosate, its European formulation and US formulation, which differ, particularly for the adjuvants present in the formulation. And with this experiment, we aim to explore all the possible cancer and non-cancer effect of this compound, which is the #1 pesticide in the world. We have to understand that health risk equal economic risk, and also the other way around. Whenever we know at this point in time, we go in poor countries, there are worse hygiene conditions, there are worse conditions, people have harder times speaking about their health. But it's also true that whenever we dump too many chemicals that we know are at very least of concern or carcinogen already, then we are certain that there are going to be not only millions of people dying, as in the case of smoking, as in the case of asbestos, but also a lot of economic impairment, because of course, when we are talking about a cycle that is based on a safe substance or on a safe chemical, this is sustainable, this is long-term. But when it's not, there will be regulation, litigation, unemployment, desperation, tensions, all of them connected to the fact that if you have tested rather cheaply this compound ahead, this wouldn't have happened. And all of this is not only affecting one stakeholder or one shareholder, which is the public, but also the whole picture, the whole economic perspective. And this is why when we want to move forward, we need to always think with the principle no data, no market, start using more and more group-based evaluations, and have a very simple principle that drives us. Whenever we read in a cosmetic, this was not tested in animals, this was not tested, ask yourself, who are they testing this chemical into? And then look at the mirror and it's yourself.
Yeah.
That's not fair. That's absolutely not fair.
Yeah.
What we have to obtain, not only in the rich country and lucky country like we are in Europe, where this principle, this no data, no market principle is already in place. But what we want to do is to have a global precautionary approach. And a global approach where when we ban a pesticide in Europe, that doesn't mean that we dump that in South America or in Africa. That shouldn't happen. And I think in this sense, I have the privilege of living for a while in the US. I can tell that the US are leading by example, for example, sharing their science all over the globe, which many people, even in very poor countries, can access for free in your data banks like PubMed and so on. The same positive attitude should be also applied in chemicals. We do some great risk assessment here, fantastic, let's share that globally, and let's use the most advanced and most protective approaches globally. That's the only way I believe we are going to protect ourselves, protect our children, and have a positive outlook of the future. I think you really touch upon one of the key aspects about what we can call the Las Vegas approach that sometimes we use with chemicals. We gamble and we hope that a certain dose will not have an effect. But too many times we don't have really solid and evidence-based reasons to base our limits upon. This is the very reason why hazard-based approach are some of the most successful and protective for public health. And what it means, hazard is this chemical a carcinogen? Is this chemical an endocrine disruptive chemical? Yes, no. If yes, then we limit it, we restrict its use, and hopefully we don't put it in things like food that really don't need a carcinogen substance in there. This kind of approach, like in the Proposition 65 in California, where there's the list of carcinogen and no reproductive toxicants to the state of California. Similarly, is the approach that we have in Europe in the EU REACH regulation of chemicals, which is based on the principle no data, no market. And if a substance goes in the list of the carcinogen or the endocrine disruptive substances, this is limited and restricted already without putting there the big issue of the risk, which is the dose.
Right.
And whenever we start talking about the dose, there might be a certain degree of, again, Las Vegas approach, gambling that some of these doses might be safe. For many chemicals, it's really hard that we have very good data. For the chemicals that are used the most, that are on the market for the longest time, many of these limits are solid and evidence-based. But for the new chemicals, for the chemicals that have not been tested as thoroughly, many times we don't really have good numbers to estimate the risk or the dose that is safe. For endocrine disruptive chemicals, even worse, because they're having even small, minute doses that are even 1,000 times lower than the one capable of inducing cancer, might still have an endocrine active effect. So this is why we are so concerned about the endocrine disruptive effect, because they can occur even at very, very low doses. So we do have a whole group of compounds, which are the endocrine disruptive chemicals, which are also one of the group of concern that the ILO put their highlight as top 10 priorities in the world of chemicals. And bisphenol A being one of them. A lot of these endocrine active chemicals are either monomer of plastics or small chemicals that tend to have like estrogen-like effect. So they tend to be to having an effect, for example, on mammary tissues, on uterus, ovary, on the fetus, on the embryo during development, and disrupt the normal hormonal balance. And why this is of concern? Because the hormonal balance use very low doses of these fantastic molecules, which are the hormones of our body, with little amount of these compounds and of these peptides. Our body sends information all over the places in our body very rapidly and effectively. But if a chemical mimics one of our hormones, even very low doses of this chemical can imbalance this marvelous system of us. So while cancer effects might take decades to appear, endocrine effects might be even immediately. And whenever these effects are happening, for example, during development, there might be alteration or even abortion induced by these chemicals. There might be problem induced in sperm count. You know, in the US, you had a reduction of more than 50% in sperm count over the last decades. And this is certainly not because of the genes, because the only thing that changed in these decades was the environment. And this is of extreme concern. You know, when we reach the 100%, this means extinction. So I really do think we have to take extremely serious the whole issue of these endocrine active substances, because even low doses can be extremely harmful, and because they are everywhere. Again, phthalates, bisphenol A, these are everywhere. Flame retardants, these are everywhere. Yep. And it's very hard to get rid of them. We certainly don't want to increase the burden of chemicals that we are already exposed to. The bond that this chemical use is not present in nature. You know, these are very tight and artificial bonds created between carbon and an halogen to do what? To make the substance very much water resistant.
Slippery.
Or slippery, you know, to speak in more right terms, probably, because that's exactly perceived.
Yeah.
So, of course, these are properties that might be extremely useful, but many times we tend to abuse to this kind of, chemicals, even in conditions that probably we really don't want to use them if we knew what the risk might be to use compounds, particularly when we have to use them in food, use them in packaging, use them in conditions, for example, where children might be exposed to these chemicals, which in many cases, and I'm speaking here of PFAS, have been found to be endocrine active substances.
One last question, Mark. We have this information. You are a trial lawyer. You want to take on a Monsanto. You want to take on a Dow Chemical. Is that possible? Is that feasible? Can you get the information? As you mentioned, it's protected by trade secrets. How do you prosecute a case like this?
Well, I think the prosecution here has to come many different levels. One, I think that we need whistleblowers, people that come forward with what they know about the chemicals and about the attempts to keep things secret and evade the law. Because most of these things, they're not, the attempts to keep the material secret, there's something not exactly upfront about it, okay? So I think it's time to weigh the health concerns and the law in a different way. I think it's time to take people first and not corporate profits first. And I think that the companies have to be gone after in a way that is more than they can handle. Okay, so far the companies get sued, they make publicity about a particular case settling or taking a verdict, and Steve, you know, we never see these companies hardly ever go out of business. You know, it's a slap on the wrist, they pay the money, by then they've got the next version of the next chemical to go out and they're making more money on it. It never ends. It just keeps going, one after the other. So what's got to happen? I think you've got to have criminal prosecution. I think you've got to have civil prosecution. I think you've got to have civil prosecution and personal injury, but also for violation of stocks and securities laws. And I think you've got to find breach of fiduciary responsibilities on behalf of accountants, CEOs, lawyers, politicians, everybody who's charged with doing their job, and they sign off on these things. These corporate accountability statements, you see these things, right? They do those so the purpose of getting the shareholders the information they're supposed to have. So they sign, a CEO signs off on what are the risks, here's what we're doing, here's what you need to know, and then it gets certified by somebody else, Steve, you know? Those big accountant firms, they sign, say they've checked it out too. Who's questioning these people about this? You know, I think it needs a full-on attack from lots of places. And it needs to be relentless, because it's our children, it's ourselves, it's our grandparents, it's us, it's all of us. And it's happening fast. The cost of not doing anything is extinction.
That's why this is a call to action, and I want to thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.